Everybody in the valley had a story about the man who owned the biggest ranch for 60 miles, and not one of them had ever seen his face. Some said he'd died back east. Some said he'd never existed at all, just a name on a deed, a signature the foreman waved around when he wanted to run a family off their water. I believed the last one mostly, because believing it was easier than believing a living man could own land like that and never once ride out to look at it. Then a February storm blew a half-frozen stranger onto my claim, and I did what my mother taught me to do with any broken thing that showed up at the door. I took him in. I gave him the good side of the fire and the last of the coffee and a name, Cowboy, because he wouldn't give me his own. I thought I was saving a lost man's life. I didn't know I was about to lose everything I understood about mine. The wind came down off the rim that night like it had a grudge, and I was out in it because a fence is a thing you fix in the weather that broke it, not the weather you'd prefer. My hands had gone past cold into that stupid warm numbness where you drop the pliers and don't feel them leave your fingers. I'd been out since the light started dying, chasing a gap in the north wire where 2 of my 4 cows had wandered through and stood, dumb as fence posts themselves, in the open where the drifts were already building against the sage. 4 cows. A person doesn't cross a winter night for 4 cows unless 4 cows is the whole of what she has, and it was the whole of what I had, so I crossed it. I'm going to tell you my name because the man in this story never would say his for the longest time, and I got tired of that, and I don't want to do to you what he did to me. Della. Della Hart, widow of Thomas Hart these 3 years, keeper of 160 deeded acres that the government gave us free, and the government's own weather has been trying to take back ever since. I talk to my mule when I'm scared. His name is Brother, and he is a poor conversationalist but a patient one. And that night I was telling him a long complaint about wire and about God and about the specific unfairness of a man dying young and leaving a woman to learn fencing from a book, when Brother did the thing mules do that horses are too proud to do. He stopped. He put his ears forward at the dark and refused to be a coward about it, which is the whole difference between a mule and a horse, and I have staked my life on that difference more than once. There was a shape in the wash below the fence line. At first I took it for a downed steer, and my heart did a mean little leap of hope, because a dead steer is meat, and I was hungry in the way you get hungry when the flour barrel echoes. Then the shape moved. Not the way a hurt animal moves. The way a man moves when he has decided he is finished and his body has not yet agreed. I want to be honest with you about the thing I felt first, because everybody in a story like this is supposed to feel compassion first, and I felt something uglier. I felt put upon. I stood in the wind with my cows still on the wrong side of the wire, and I looked at the trouble crawling up out of the wash, and I thought, plain as anything, I do not have enough for me. I surely do not have enough for you. And then I went and got him anyway, because thinking a thing and doing its opposite is most of what being a decent person turns out to be. He was heavier than a man should be, which is snow and soaked wool and the dead weight of somebody who stopped helping you carry him. I got him belly down over Brother's back like a sack of feed, and I lost a mitten doing it, and I said words my mother would have washed my mouth for, and the whole way back to the house, the man's fingers dragged little furrows in the fresh snow, and I kept thinking they looked like the last thing a person writes. Here is my house, 1 room and a lean-to, a stove my husband hauled 40 miles and was prouder of than he was of me, and I say that without bitterness because he was right to be. That stove has outlasted him. A rope bed, a table with 3 good legs and 1 apologized for by a stone, a shelf with my mother's Bible and a tin of buttons and the ledger where I keep the count of everything I owe, which was the fullest book in the house. I got him down in front of the stove, and I peeled the frozen things off him with a knife where they wouldn't come by hand, and that's when the first strangeness caught my eye, though I was too busy to hold it. His boots. Under the mud and the cracked open sole and the snow, his boots were made. Not bought off a mercantile shelf and not cobbled by some town drunk with an awl. Made. Stitched double at the counter, the leather good enough that even ruined it had a shine to it under the grime, the kind of boots that cost more than my whole herd. A drifting cowboy doesn't wear a rich man's boots unless he stole them, and a man who'd steal boots that fine wouldn't wear them out to nothing in a country where being caught in stolen boots gets you hung off the nearest cottonwood. I filed it away. You file a lot of things away when you live alone. It's how you stay alive, you notice, and you don't say, and you keep the noticing in a drawer for later. He didn't wake that first night. I sat up with him because you don't warm a froze man too fast. Thomas taught me that, one of the few useful inheritances, and I watched his face come back from wherever it had gone. He had a good face and a hard one both, weathered dark, a white scar through one eyebrow, 3 days of beard going gray at the chin, though the rest of him wasn't old, maybe 40, maybe a rough 35. His hands were the puzzle that went with the boots. Calloused, sure, but not a working man's calluses in the working man's places. His palms were soft where a rope wears you and hard where a pen and a rifle do, and I turned one of those hands over in mine to chafe the blood back, and I thought, you have not done a real day's labor in a long while, whoever you are, and yet you are dressed like a man who has done nothing else. Toward dawn he spoke without waking. Just one word, thick and slurred, and I leaned in to catch it because a person's sleeping words are the truest thing about them. He said sorry. Not to me, to somebody who wasn't in the room. I've said that word to somebody who wasn't in the room too. I stopped chafing his hand and I sat back and I let him keep it, whatever it was, and I understood him a little then in the way you understand a stranger before you know a single fact about him. The way you understand that a dog that flinches has been hit. He woke on the second day and lied to me inside of a minute. His eyes came open all at once, the way a man's do who's used to waking somewhere he has to assess before he moves. He took in the roof beams, the stove, the smell of the beans, me sitting there with the shotgun across my knees, not pointed at him, but present, the way a fact is present, and I watched him build himself a story behind his eyes before he said a word. Where? He started and coughed, and I gave him water and he drank it careful, watching me over the rim like I was the strange thing in the room and not the other way around. My claim, I said, north end of the Sweetwater bench, found you in the wash off my fence. You'd have been dead by morning. He absorbed that. Whose land is this? Now that is a peculiar first question. Not what day is it or how bad am I or is there anybody after me, which were the questions I'd have laid money on. He wanted to know whose land. And there was something under the question, some tightness, like the answer mattered more than his own condition did. Mine, I said, deeded and proved up Della Hart. Something moved across his face and was gone. Relief. No, something more complicated than relief. And the big outfit, he said, runs south and west of here, circle A the Ashby Range. I felt my mouth go flat. Everybody's mouth goes flat at that name in this country. You know it. I know of it. And there was the first lie, small and smooth, told without a flicker, and I only knew it was a lie because I'd been watching his hands, and his hands went still in a way that faces can learn to hide but hands almost never do. Passed through, looking for work. Well, I said, you found a fence and near froze on it. If that's your notion of looking for work, you'll want a new notion. I set the beans in front of him. Eat. You can tell me your name while you do it. He looked at the beans a long time. Then he looked at me, and I'll give him this. When he decided to lie to me about his name, he had the grace to look ashamed of it, which is more than most men manage. Cole, he said, which turned out later to be true or half-true, the way the most dangerous lies are. Cole what? Just Cole. He ate a mouthful and closed his eyes, and I saw exactly how hungry he'd been and how long, and whatever he was, he'd been out in the cold country a good while, not comfortable, not a man in the middle of an easy life. It's the name I've got to give right now, missus. I'll owe you the rest of it. "You'll owe me a lot of things," I said. "Board and doctoring and a mitten. But a man's name isn't a debt I'd collect by force. Keep it if you need it." I don't know why I said that. I think because I have things I keep too, and a person who won't grant another the same mercy she'd want is not a person I care to be. He looked at me then like I'd handed him something. It's a thing I've thought about a great deal since, that of all the things I gave that man, the one that seemed to undo him most was the smallest. I let him keep a secret. Nobody in a long while, I came to learn, had let Cole Ashby keep anything at all. The snow held us 2 weeks. I want to slow down here, because those 2 weeks are where the whole rest of it grew from, and if I rush past them you won't believe what came after. You have to understand how a person gets folded into your days. It isn't a lightning strike. It's 100 small accommodations, and each one seems like nothing. And then you look up one morning, and the shape of your life has a second person in it, and you can't for your life remember agreeing to that. He couldn't ride out, his feet had frostbite in 2 toes, and I wasn't going to lose him to gangrene after saving him from the cold. So I kept him near the stove, and I doctored his feet with the goose grease and the ugly patience that doctoring feet requires. But a proud man on his back invents work for his hands, and inside a few days Cole had taken over every seated task in the house. He mended harness. He whittled me a 4th true leg for the table so I could take back my apology to it. He fixed the stove door that had hung crooked since Thomas died, and he did it in about 10 minutes, and I stood there feeling absurdly betrayed that a thing I'd lived crooked with for 3 years had been that simple all along. And he watched. That was the thing about Cole. He watched everything the way I do, the way you learn to when watching has kept you alive. He watched me feed the cows, and I saw him counting them, and I saw him keep his face still over the count of 4. He watched me open the ledger one night and run my finger down the figures and press my knuckle against my mouth, and he didn't ask, and I loved him a little for not asking and hated him a little for seeing. Because the ledger was the truth of my life, and the truth was this: I was going to lose the claim. Not to the weather, to the note. When Thomas died there'd been a debt on the seed and the cattle and the wire, a debt I'd have cleared in 3 good years and had not had 1 good year of the 3. The note had been bought up, the way notes get bought up in a country where one outfit has all the money, by the Circle A by Ashby. By the ghost nobody had ever seen, whose foreman, a smiling wide man named Dexter Pyle, had ridden out to my place twice now to remind me, in the gentlest and most frightening voice you ever heard, that the last payment came due in the spring, and that Mr. Ashby was not a sentimental man, and that a woman alone might find selling out and moving to town a great relief. I told Cole none of that, but I think he read it off the ledger and off my knuckle at my mouth, because the night after he saw me at the book, he asked me, careful, sideways, whittling and not looking up, how a person came to owe money to a man they'd never met. And I told him about Pyle. God help me, I told the wrong man everything. I told him how Pyle had run the Rasmussen family off their spring the summer before, cut their fence, and let their stock scatter, and then bought their proved-up claim for pennies when they couldn't hold it. How 3 families had gone that way in 2 years, and every one of their deeds now flew the Circle A brand, and how the ghost owner back east either didn't know or didn't care, and how I'd stopped being able to tell the difference between a man who did evil and a man who let it be done in his name, and pocketed the profit and called himself clean. "There's no difference," Cole said. I looked up. He'd stopped whittling. His face had gone to stone, that hard face, and his voice when it came out was low and even, and it frightened me more than Pyle's smiling ever had. "A man who lets it be done in his name," he said, "and takes the good of it is worse than the one who does it, because the one who does it at least has to look at what he is." "You sound like you've thought on it." "I've had cause," he said, and went back to the wood, and would not say another word that night, and I lay awake on the far side of the room listening to him not sleep either, 2 people in the dark each keeping a secret from the other, and neither of us as alone in it as we thought. The thing that broke it open was the watch. I wasn't snooping. I want that understood. His clothes were rags I was trying to make wearable so he could leave with dignity when his feet healed, and I was going through the pockets before I cut them down, the way any careful woman does, and in the little watch pocket of the ruined vest there was a watch. Gold, heavy, older than him, an heirloom, the kind of thing passed down. And on the inside of the case, when I thumbed it open, an engraving worn soft by other thumbs over other years. To my son C.A., the land keeps no man, a man keeps the land. J.A. C.A. And I stood in my one-room house with the wind picking up again outside, and the ghost's name I'd curse it 100 times sitting cold and gold in my palm, and I did the arithmetic that any fool could do. Cole Ashby. The man I'd carried in out of the snow. The man who'd fixed my stove and whittled my table a leg and let me feed him from a barrel that echoed. The man who owned the note that was going to take my home. The ghost. The one nobody had ever seen. He'd been sitting at my table for 2 weeks eating my beans and watching me press my knuckle to my mouth over a debt I owed to him. And he had let me tell him every private terror of my life while he sat there and said nothing, and gave me a false last name, and let me call him Cowboy. I turned around with the watch in my hand. He was awake. He was sitting up on the pallet by the stove, and he'd seen, of course he'd seen, he saw everything, and he wasn't building a story behind his eyes anymore. There was no story left to build. He just looked at me, and the hard face was gone, and what was under it was so tired and so ashamed and so much like a man waiting to be hit that for 1 second, one traitor second, before the fury came up in me like floodwater, I felt sorry for him. Then the fury came. "Get out of my house," I said. He didn't get out, that's the first thing. I told a man to leave my house into a country that was 30 degrees below freezing and had already tried once to kill him, and I want you to know I meant it when I said it. I meant it with my whole chest, and I want you to know too that I'd have hated myself forever if he'd done it. That's the trap of a mercy like mine. Once you've decided you're the kind of person who takes in broken things, you don't get to undecide it just because the broken thing turns out to be the one who broke you. He knew it too. That's what makes what he did next matter. He tried to go. He got up off the pallet on his ruined feet, and he pulled his cut-down rags on with his back to me so I wouldn't see his face, and he got as far as the door with the wind screaming on the other side of it, and he put his hand on the latch, and he stood there. And I stood behind him with the watch still in my fist, so angry I was shaking, and neither of us moved, and the fire popped, and brother stamped once in the lean-to, and the whole world narrowed down to a man's hand on a door latch, and the question of whether he was going to be fool enough to walk through it. "You'll die," I said. My voice came out wrong, not the way I meant it. "That's the general idea some days," he said to the door. Quiet, not asking for pity, just true. And that landed in me sideways and knocked the anger loose from whatever it had been standing on, and I heard myself say, "Sit down, Cole Ashby, before you fall down. We are not finished, but we are not finishing it with you frozen to my doorpost." He turned around. He looked at me holding his own father's watch, hearing his own full name in my mouth for the first time, and something in him just gave. Not collapsed. Gave the way ice gives on a river in the spring, with a sound you feel in your feet before you hear it. He came back to the stove and he sat down and he put his face in his hands, and this man who owned 60 miles of country, this ghost that had run families off their water, sat in my one-room house and shook, and did not make a single sound while he did it, which is the way men cry who have taught themselves it isn't allowed. I did not comfort him. I want to be clear. I sat down across the room with the shotgun and the watch, and I let him shake because I was owed my anger and I was not going to be talked or shamed out of it, not even by grief. But I didn't leave the room either. There's a kind of company you can keep with a person you're furious at if you've decided their pain is real. I kept it. It was the meanest kindness I had, and it was all I could offer, and I offered it. When he could talk, he told me the truth. all of it. And I'm going to give it to you the way he gave it to me, slow and out of order, the way the truth actually comes out of a person, not the neat way a liar arranges it. He had never wanted the ranch. His father, Josiah Ashby, the man in the watch, had built the Circle A out of nothing and hard dealing, and a talent for being in the country early, and he'd raised his only son to inherit it with the specific, grinding cruelty of a man who confuses breaking a thing with making it strong. Cole had left at 19. Gone east, gone to a war that came after, come back changed the way war changes a man. And by then the old man was dying and there was nobody else. And Cole took the deed the way you take a coffin you're expected to carry. Because the alternative is to let it drop, and you were raised not to let things drop. But he couldn't bear the place, couldn't bear the house his father had ruled from, couldn't bear the men who'd been his father's men, couldn't bear standing on ground that his whole boyhood had been a lesson in never being enough for. So he did the coward's version of leaving. He stayed in name and fled in body. He signed the deed and moved to town, then to a bigger town, then east again, and he handed the running of it to the most capable man on the payroll, Dexter Pyle. And he told himself that capable was the same as trustworthy, because telling himself that let him stop looking. For 8 years, he did not ride his own land. The money came. Pyle sent reports, and the reports were good, and the reports never said I burned the Rasmussens off their spring, or I bought the widow Hart's note to squeeze her out. The reports said acquired the Rasmussen parcel and consolidated the North Water rights, and Cole read those words in a hotel 2,000 miles away and signed where he was told to sign, and did not ask what acquired had cost anybody, because asking was the one thing his whole life had trained him to be too tired to do. And then, he said, a man wrote me a letter, not Pyle. One of the hands a kid couldn't hardly spell. He wrote to tell me what was being done in my name because he'd run out of ways to live with it. And I read that letter and I understood that I'd become exactly the thing I'd spent my whole life swearing I'd never be. My father, worse than my father. My father at least looked at what he was. So he came west, told no one, got off the train 4 counties away and bought a horse and rode toward his own ranch dressed as a saddle tramp, because he wanted to see it the way the country saw it, from below, from the outside, from the position of the people Pyle was grinding. He wanted to know the truth before he walked into that big house and had the truth managed for him. He'd been at it 3 weeks, drifting, listening in the little towns, hearing his own name cursed at every rail and bar, when the February storm caught him in the open and put him in my wash and put him at my table. And then, he said, and here his voice finally broke all the way, the first house the truth walked me into was yours, and the truth was you out in that storm for 4 cows, you feeding me out of a barrel I could hear was near empty, you cursing my name over a note I hold, and never once turning me out into the cold even after. Della, I have owned this country for 8 years, and I never once saw it until I saw you carry me across it on a mule. I sat with that a long time. The fire got low and I didn't feed it. That's a fine speech, I said at last, and my voice was steady and it was cruel and I needed it to be both. You've had 3 weeks and a lot of empty road to practice being sorry. Now I'll tell you what sorry's worth to me. Nothing. Not one thin dime. Sorry is what a man says instead of doing. My husband is 3 years dead and I have run this claim alone and I have never once had the luxury of sorry. I have only ever had do the next thing. So don't you sit at my stove and hand me your beautiful pain, Cole Ashby. You want to be forgiven? Fine. Go and unruin the people Pyle ruined in your name. Go and tear that note up in front of me. Go and do something. And maybe I'll believe your sorry was more than a warm place to put your shame. He looked at me, and here is the moment I fell for him, and I have never been able to explain it to myself in any way that flatters me, so I've stopped trying. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't tell me I didn't understand. He said, "You're right." Just that. You're right. And he meant it, and it cost him nothing to say, and it cost him everything, both. And I sat in my dark house, and I understood that I had just fallen half in love with a man for the simple, almost unheard of act of a powerful person agreeing with a poor one and meaning it. I did not tell him that. I fed the fire and I went to bed, but I gave him back his father's watch before I did, set it on the table by the leg he'd whittled, and I saw him look at it and not touch it, like a man who hadn't decided yet whether he had the right. Pyle came 4 days later. Cole's feet had healed enough that he could stand a boot, and we'd reached a truce that wasn't peace. We worked the place together in a wary, careful quiet, and I let him because 4 cows and a broke fence go easier with 2, and because I was watching to see if his "you're right" had legs under it or was just more talk. He hadn't ridden for the ranch. He'd said he needed to understand the whole of what Pyle had done before he moved, and I'd allowed that was sense. And also I'd noticed he seemed in no hurry to leave my table, and I'd allowed that too, and I hadn't looked too hard at why I was glad. Then Brother threw his ears at the South Trail, and it was Pyle and 2 of his men, riding up out of a bright cold morning with their breath smoking, and Cole did a thing I'll never forget. He didn't run and he didn't hide. He picked up the axe by the woodpile like he was a hired hand about to go back to splitting, and he set his hat low, and he turned his face half away and he became a saddle tramp. You could watch him do it. Watch him pull the ranch owner down inside himself and button a nobody over the top of it, and he said to me, low and fast, "Don't tell him who I am. Not yet. I need to hear him say it to my face without knowing whose face it is. Trust me 1 more inch, Della. 1 inch." And Lord forgive me, I did. Pyle reined up smiling. He was always smiling. He was a big, soft-looking man with small, hard eyes and the manners of a preacher and the heart of a bank foreclosure, and he tipped his hat to me and called me Miss Hart like we were friends, and asked after my winter like he hadn't bought the note that was strangling it. "Fine," I said. "What do you want, Mr. Pyle?" "Just neighboring." He looked at Cole by the woodpile and didn't think a thing of him, a drifter widow's hired help, beneath notice, and that's the poison of a man like Pyle, that the whole world is beneath his notice until it costs him something. Though I'll say plain since you ask plain, that note comes due in 6 weeks. Mr. Ashby, take it kindly if you saved us both the ugliness. Sell to the Circle A now at a fair figure. I'll go $70, which is more than the place'll fetch after he smiled. After the spring, when a woman alone finds the work's too much. 70 now, or nothing later. Mr. Ashby is not a sentimental man. I saw Cole's hands tighten on the axe handle. "And how would you know," I said to buy Cole a breath, "what Mr. Ashby is or isn't? Anybody ever even seen the man?" Pyle laughed, comfortable, sure of himself in the way that would in about 6 weeks be the ruin of him. "Ms. Hart," he said, "I am Mr. Ashby for every purpose that touches this country. He's a signature and a bank draft and a man too fine for his own dirt. He signs where I tell him, and he's never once ridden out here in 8 years, and he never will. This is my range. His name's just the paint on it." He tipped his hat again. $70, think on it. I'll be back." He turned his horse, and Cole spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He set the axe down slow, and he straightened up out of the saddle tramp slouch. And he pushed his hat back so his face came into the light, and he said, in that low, even tone that had frightened me the night he talked about men who let things be done in their name, "His name's not the paint, Dexter. His name's the deed, and he's ridden out here now. I have seen a lot of things in a hard life. I have never seen a man's face fall the way Dexter Pyle's fell when Cole Ashby said his own 2 words, Cole Ashby. And Pyle, who'd worked 8 years for a signature he'd never had to face, looked at the drifter by the widow's woodpile and saw his father's bones in the man's jaw and knew, in one white sick instant, that the ghost had been sitting at a poor woman's fire the whole time he'd been out here in the cold, listening. Mr. Pyle started. 6 weeks, Cole said. "You said the note comes due in 6 weeks. I'll expect a full accounting of this range at the house by then. Every acre, every family, every parcel you acquired. And Dexter," and here Cole smiled, and it was his father's smile, I'd learn later, the one thing of the old man's he'd never wanted and couldn't help, you're going to wish you'd been sentimental." Pyle rode off without another word. But at the top of the South Trail he stopped, and he looked back, and I saw him do a piece of arithmetic of his own, and I did not like the sum his small, hard eyes came to. Because a man like Pyle, cornered, doesn't repent. A man like Pyle counts the witnesses. And there were two of us. The Apache came the night before the reckoning, and I have to tell you about him now, because leaving him for last would be doing to him the exact thing I've spent this whole story hatting, treating a man as the paint and not the deed. His name was Nate, not the famous one, he'd tell you dry as dust, just a man his mother named Hopeful, and he'd been Cole's father's tracker in the early years, and then Pyle's, until Pyle stopped paying Apache men what he paid white ones and Nate stopped working for Pyle. He lived up in the Rimrock with his wife and a grown son, on land nobody could deed because nobody white had figured out yet how to steal a canyon, and he knew this country the way I knew my own ledger, every figure, every debt, every place where the sum didn't come out honest. He rode down to my place 2 nights before the note came due, because word travels in the Rimrock faster than it travels on the rail, and the word was this: Pyle had hired men, not cowhands, the other kind. 3 of them from down along the border, the kind of men you pay to make a witness stop being a witness. And Pyle had let it be known, quiet, in the way such things get let known, that come the due date there was likely to be a fire at the Hart claim, a tragedy, a widow alone in a careless stove, and a drifter she'd taken in who'd turn out, once the ashes cooled and the story got told, to be some saddle tramp of no account. No Ashby at all, just a con man who'd fooled a lonesome woman. Both of them dead in the sad, predictable way that lonesome people out here so often died. Pyle was going to burn us and write the story after. He'd done it to the Rasmussen's barn. He knew the trick of it. Kill the witnesses and you get to be the one who says what happened. Nate told us this sitting at my table, drinking my coffee, and when he finished he looked at Cole a long time. "Your father," he said, "would have already been on his horse to the house, gathering men, meeting it head-on and loud and getting 3 good people killed doing it, because being right in front of a lot of witnesses mattered more to Josiah Ashby than being alive." He set the cup down. "Are you your father?" And I watched Cole understand that the whole question of his life had just been set on my table in the shape of a coffee cup, and that how he answered it would decide whether he was the man his father made or the man he'd been trying, out here in the cold, to become. "No," Cole said, "I'm not." "Then don't meet it head-on and loud," Nate said. "Meet it smart and quiet and keep the woman alive, because the woman is worth more than your pride and more than being right in front of witnesses. There's a way, but you'll have to let go of wanting Pyle to see you win. Can you do that? Can you beat a man and not need him to watch you do it? Here is the morally heavy thing, and I'm going to lay it out plain because it's the hinge the whole story swings on. Cole wanted Pyle destroyed in front of everyone. He wanted the big house full of witnesses and Pyle broken publicly, and the deed thrown in his face, because 8 years of shame had made him hungry for one clean, loud moment of being the good man in front of a crowd. And Nate was telling him that the loud, clean moment was exactly what would get me killed, that a quiet man who saved a widow and let the bad man merely lose, privately, unwatched, was worth more than a proud man who won a spectacle over my ashes. Cole chose me over the spectacle. I need you to understand what that cost a man built the way he was built, raised the way he was raised. He chose the quiet. He chose the version where nobody would ever tell the story of how Cole Ashby faced down Dexter Pyle, because in that version I was alive to not tell it. I won't give you the fight the way a dime novel would, because it wasn't that, and dressing it up would be a lie, and I've had my fill of lies. They came the night of the due date, the 3 border men, on foot, quiet, with coal oil and matches and the patience of men who have done it before. And we weren't there. That was Nature's plan, and it was almost unbearably simple. And it worked because Pyle's whole life had trained him to believe that a widow and a drifter and an Apache couldn't outthink him. We'd left the house dark and the stove cold and the two of us gone up into the rimrock, and Nature's son had ridden hard and quiet the other direction. Not to the Circle A, where Pyle's men were, but 40 miles to the county seat, to the one U.S. Marshal in the territory who didn't take Circle of money, carrying a letter in Cole Ashby's own hand, and sealed with his father's watch pressed into the wax, laying out everything. The note buying, the burnings, the hired men, the fire that was coming for the Hart claim on this exact night. A letter that made the deed's true owner the accuser and the foreman the criminal. A letter that could only be written by a man willing to stand up in a courtroom and confess that he'd let it all happen in his name, to make himself in front of a judge, the fool and the absentee and the man who looked away, in order to make Pyle the thing he was. Cole confessed his own worst self in writing to save me. That was the price of the quiet way, and he paid it, and no crowd ever cheered him for it, and that's how I knew it was real. The border men fired the empty house. We watched from the rim. I watched my home burn everything. The stove Thomas hauled 40 miles, my mother's Bible, the ledger, the table with the whittled leg, all of it going up gold and roaring in the black, and Cole put his hand on my shoulder and I let him. And I did not look away, because a person should look at what it costs to be free of a thing. And when the marshal came at dawn with Nature's son and 4 deputies, and found 3 border killers standing in the light of a house they'd been paid to burn, with a widow and a witness alive in the rimrock, and a signed letter from the ranch's true owner naming every name, Dexter Pyle's arithmetic came out wrong at last. In the one column he'd never thought to check. He'd counted the witnesses. He'd forgotten to count the one witness who was rich enough and ruined enough to testify against his own self. The ranch is mine now, part of it. I'll tell you how, because it's the least neat part and therefore the truest. Cole didn't give me the Circle A. I want to correct that before the story rounds itself off too pretty. He didn't ride up and lay 60 miles of country at my feet like the ending of some cheap romance. And if he'd tried, I'd have thrown it back at him, because I'd already told him what I thought of grand gestures from powerful men, and I hadn't changed my mind. What he did was harder and smaller, and I have come to think it's the only thing he could have done that I'd have been able to bear. He tore up my note in front of me, at the county seat, the way I'd told him to that first cold night. Just my note. The $70 debt that had been strangling one small woman. And then he asked the marshal and the judge to help him find every family Pyle had run off, the Rasmussens and the others, and give back what could be given not as charity, which humiliates, but as restitution, which is only justice with the shame put on the right man's account. And then he had in his hands, on the burned ground of my claim where the stove sat cooling in the ash, whether I would help him learn to run the thing he owned, because he did not know how, and I did, and he'd rather learn it from a woman who'd fought a whole winter for 4 cows than from any man his father would have hired. I said I'd think on it. I made him wait a week for the answer, too, not out of cruelty, out of the plain fact that I had learned, at a terrible price, that a sorry and a grand feeling are worth nothing until a person watches what you do with them over time, and I was not going to hand my one wild heart to a man I'd known 6 weeks, however that man had bled for me, until I'd seen his good intentions survive a little ordinary daylight. They have, it's been a year. I don't run the Circle A, I run a piece of it, the small holder piece, the part that Pyle spent 8 years trying to swallow. I run it so that no widow on the Sweetwater bench ever again owes her whole life to a name she's never seen. Cole runs the rest, badly and improving, and he asks me things, and sometimes he takes my answer and sometimes he doesn't, and I've stopped needing him to always take it, which is its own kind of love and a harder one than the storybook kind. Nate has a paper deed to his canyon now. Cole saw to it. It's the first thing his father's whole empire ever produced that the old man would have hated, and Cole framed the copy and hung it in the big house where the old portrait used to be, and I have watched him stand in front of it some evenings the way another man might stand in front of a grave, and I have not asked him what he sees, because some things a person keeps, and I let him keep them. He gave me back my mother's Bible in the end. It didn't burn all the way. The marshal's men turned it up in the ash, scorched black at the edges but whole in the middle, the way the middle of a thing sometimes survives the burning of its edges. I keep it on a new shelf in a new house. I keep the tin of buttons too. I have started a new ledger, and the first page of it is not a list of what I owe. Sometimes, on the cold nights, Cole gets quiet the way he did that first winter, and I know he's back in the shame of the 8 years, the man who looked away, and no amount of what he's done since ever seems to fully burn it out of him. And on those nights I don't hand him forgiveness, because forgiveness handed over easy is worth nothing, and we both learned that the hard way. I just feed the fire, and I let him keep his secret grief, and I stay in the room. That's the mercy I had that first night when I let a lying stranger keep his name. It turned out to be the only mercy either of us ever really needed, not the grand kind, the kind that stays in the room. He still won't tell me what he says sorry to in his sleep. After all of it, he still says it, some nights, to somebody who isn't there. I have stopped believing it's his father. I have started to be afraid it's